Now, I want to talk about the idea of consciousness for a minute. We sometimes, take it for granted, but you've been thinking about all of these lines of evidence all through this curriculum series. What are you using in order to think about? Are you using your brain? Well, in a sense you are. Are you using your mind? Do you think you actually possess a mind? Sometimes when we're working criminal investigations, we have to identify suspects. And it can be confusing because the person might say, I know the person who did this is J. Warner Wallace. But somebody else might know me as Jim Wallace. Well, how do I know that J. Warner Wallace is the same person that somebody else describes as Jim Wallace? Well, if all of my attributes as J. Warner Wallace are identical to all the attributes I have as Jim Wallace, then this one-to-one relationship, this law of identity, says that we are one and the same person. Jim Wallace is, in fact, identical to J. Warner Wallace, at least this Jim Wallace. Okay, this law of identity is helpful because when we start to think about consciousness, we have to ask the question, are we entirely physical beings? Are we using our brain right now to think about this, or are you using your mind to? We seem to have this sense, this experience of consciousness. But how do we explain that experience if atheism is true, and all we can use to explain our consciousness is space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Look, the brain is easier to explain, right? It's physical. If we are in a physical universe, then physical things like brains make sense. But non-material things that, say, Christians often think exist, like angels and demons and souls and minds, these are not easy to explain in a physical universe. This is why philosophers typically call this the problem of mind. Well, how do we explain mind? Do we actually have minds? Some are inclined to say, well, no, we're in a physical universe governed by physical laws, so all we really have is a brain, and everything you think you're experiencing as a mind is simply an artifact of your physical brain. But I'm here to tell you, I think there is good evidence to indicate that your mind is something different than your brain, and we're going to use the law of identity to do it. Here's what I mean. If every aspect of brain is identical to every aspect of mind, then we can just say there are no minds. It's just we're experiencing our brain activity. But if there are different properties to mind than there are to brain, then we'd have to at least concede that there are two different things. There are certain things that are true about brains and certain things that are true about mind. Let me offer you several lines of evidence to help you see that these are, in fact, two different things. The first is a very simple one. It's the distinction between public and private. Your brain is entirely public, but your thoughts, your mind is entirely private. So I could, for example, take off your skull cap and have to run an experiment where I am looking at your physical brain. I could see your physical brain. It's publicly available to me. But your mind is not publicly available to me. It's privately held by you. Even if I could see some activity, that neurons that are firing in your brain, I'd have to ask you, well, what are you thinking? To try to associate that with your brain. Your brain is publicly available. Your thoughts are privately held. And this difference between public and private demonstrates at the very first level that we are talking about two different things here, brain and mind. There's another distinction between mind and brain that's really interesting, and philosophers call this intentionality. What it means is basically this. Our mental states are always about something. We worry about our job. We think about what we're going to eat for lunch. They are not what we would say self-existent. Well, the lunch is self-existent. Some things, material things, they just exist. They are self-existent. But your thoughts, your mental states are not self-existent. They are about something else. That makes them very different. So your brain exists, it's self-existent, but your thoughts, your mind, the activity in your mind, your mental states they're dependent on something else. They are not self-existent. This difference I call the difference between isness, things that just are, and aboutness, things that are about something else. So this difference between isness and aboutness, as I call it, is yet another difference between your brain and your mind. Let me give you another example of the difference between mind and brain. I might hear a noise in the next room and think there's a burglar in the next room. But I'm wrong. There's no burglar in the next room. I'm afraid there is. Now, I could be wrong about the presence of a burglar, the existence of the burglar in the next room, but my fear of the burglar in the next room is indisputable. This is the difference between physical things and mental states. You cannot dispute that I'm having a belief, I'm having a fear, that's indisputable, but the actual physical reality of the thing I'm worried about, the thing I'm afraid of, that is something we could falsify. And this is yet again the difference between physical things like burglars and brains and non-physical things like minds and beliefs, fears, and thoughts. We've now discovered yet another thing that separates mind from brain. Yet another way that minds are different than brains. Look, we get trained all the time to experience some crazy things in law enforcement. And you can train us in a certain way on what we're going to experience. You can tell us in advance of what your body is going to do when confronted with violence or confronted with a threat. You can understand the physiology of your body. But until you've experienced it firsthand, you could think you know everything there is to know, but you haven't experienced it, and you don't yet know what your reactions are going to be, how you're going to perceive things differently. In other words, there are a set of things that could be known impersonally and objectively because we can examine the physical nature of these things. But your experiences, your reactions, we cannot do. We cannot know those things. Those are subjective. Those are the things that you experience personally. And this difference between objective, impersonal, physical realities and the personal reactions we have subjectively is yet another distinction between physicality, brains, and non-physicality, minds. And let me give you one more that seems pretty obvious. I could actually remove my brain and measure it in some way. I could put it on a scale, measure its weight. I could measure its width. I could measure its length. I could measure its mass. But you cannot measure the mass of your thoughts. You cannot measure the length of your thoughts or the weight of your thoughts. There are differences between mental states and physical states. And one is immeasurable and one is measurable. Yet another difference, let's put it in diagram form. Take a look at this diagram. This diagram shows you 5 lines of evidence that distinguish mind from brain. We have good reasons to believe that your brain is not the same as your mind. Now, why is that important? Well, think about it. If we're staying inside the realm of the universe to explain what we experience in our thought life, well, brains are easy to explain because they could be part of a process, a physical process governed by physical laws that could produce a physical brain. But minds are entirely immaterial. How do we get mind, something immaterial? What evolutionary process can deal with matter, and suddenly something immaterial emerges? How does that happen? This is why we call it the problem of mind. Now, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of people who have tried to describe this from inside the room. And what they typically do is, in many cases, is try to redefine what we mean by mind, change the definition to make it a little easier, or they'll offer an explanation that really is not supported by any evidence. They'll say that maybe the minds emerge through some physical process, but we have no actual evidence that that is the case. I will be talking about some of these in your participants guide, so take a look. I'll go through some of the explanations that people offer from within the room, but I want to feature one and highlight it here. And that is this something called behaviorism. If we could redefine our thoughts, our mental states, as simply behaviors, so to say that I'm sad and then you see me frowning, what you're really describing is the behavior of frowning. So the sad thing, this word you're using to describe frowning is simply a description of a physical behavior. Well, that makes it easier to explain from inside the room, right? Because it's just a physical behavior described by physical laws are governing a physical universe. Now, there's a problem with behaviorism, though, because think about it. There are times when I'm sad, but I don't express it. And if I'm not expressing it, how can you call my behavior as identical to my thought life? It's not. There are times when I will also, if behavior is identical to your thought life, I wouldn't even know how I feel until I look in the mirror and see what my behavior is. But clearly, I have something that precedes all of that, a sensation, a thought, a feeling, a response that precedes my physical action, my physical behavior. This idea that behaviors could somehow be identical to your thought life and therefore could be explained by physical processes just doesn't work. Now, there is another way to get conscious mind, another way to get consciousness. What if the source of everything we see in the universe is itself a mind that creates in its image other living beings that possess a characteristic of the Creator? We have minds, just like the creative mind that created us. That would explain why we experience the kind of consciousness we experience that cannot be explained through physical processes or with any of the explanations that I'm offering from inside the room in your participants guide. And now we have another attribute we can add to our list describing this causal suspect that is responsible for everything we see in the universe. It appears that he is timeless, spaceless, immaterial. He is an uncreated, uncaused first cause that's all-powerful, that is creative enough to just fine-tune the universe with purpose for life to emerge, and then is the source of information in biology that is responsible for all DNA, and that is also the designer behind the design we see in biology, and is a mind that designs in its image other beings that have minds. We have another fifth piece of evidence that cannot be explained from inside the room. The best explanation is, once again, outside the room.